بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to Up in Smoke. So now let's be honest, how many of you came for a fatwa tonight to smoke weed? We actually have hands put up. So just to tell you that there will be no fatwas given and we will not be giving out samples. If you see smoke, it is actually a fire. Exit the building as soon as you see that, inshallah. With that having been said, we do have a lot of material to go through. This is what the game plan is going to be. I'm going to give a 10-minute introduction, inshallah. This is just a general introduction to what marijuana is, what are the things you need to know about it, the Islamic ruling on it. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Nazir then. He's going to be speaking about the medicinal side or the medical side of it and its health consequences. Then Sheikh Ali is going to be speaking about the social aspects of it and how it actually impacts our youth. It's going to come back to me, and my concluding session is going to be how to actually talk to your youth about this issue, inshallah, and what strategies youth can use before they make decisions that can alter the path of their life. Altogether, the presentation should be between 45 minutes to an hour, and we want to leave about half an hour for Q&A. So we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes our journey easy for us today. So the first thing, cannabis, that is the official name of this concept that we're speaking about. It comes from this plant known as Cannabis sativa, and more commonly it is known as marijuana. But you'll also notice that it has many other terms, and we'll get into that later on, particularly for parents. If you see these names on your children's phones or you hear your children talking about them, they're being shared so you are aware of them. After alcohol, cannabis is the second most commonly used psychoactive. It is the secondly most commonly used psychoactive. There are 400 chemicals inside marijuana. The two main ones that you need to know about and be familiar with are THC and CBD. These two are very important to know because when you start talking about the Islamic rulings of them, you're going to be hearing these terms. So THC and CBD. THC is the element or the chemical inside marijuana that actually affects your mind. So it is what gives you the high, it is what makes you feel good and gives you those other feelings as well. The most commonly used type of THC or the most common proponent of THC is known as Delta 9. And that is the actual drug element inside marijuana. CBD, that is what is being researched right now in terms of its medicinal properties, and we'll be talking about that later on. How do you identify marijuana? Usually it's green in color and can go all the way to brown, and it has a very strong odor, particularly when it is smoked. And that is why if you ever go to a park and you smell this strange odor, that's how usually marijuana is identified, by its odor. What are other names that marijuana is known by? It is known as marijuana, a bud, a blunt, chronic, dab, dope, ganja, grass, hash, herb, joint, Mary Jane, MJ, pot, reefer, skunk, smoke, trees, wax, and weed. I did not come up with this list by myself. I don't know half of these lists, but as one of the resources that we have for you tonight, inshallah, is this book. It has many more names beyond that. I just use the most commonly ones present. So these resources will be made available to you after the presentation, inshallah. They're already present here, and then we'll pass them out after the session is over. How exactly is marijuana used? How do people actually use marijuana? And this is familiar. I know a lot of this is going to be funny, and I'm trying to keep it lighthearted, but it's a very serious matter. So often when marijuana is used, it is used as something that you smoke and you inhale. If you smoke it or if you roll it in a cigarette form, this is known as a joint. If you make it thicker like a cigar, this is known as a blunt. And then you can also smoke it with water, and that water pipe is known as a bong. Some of you already know the names. I'm like, what is going on? I'm like, did you do this presentation already? Don't worry, there's no shaming tonight. I mean, look, this is part of our culture, as in, it's part of Canadian culture, right? It's becoming legal on October 17th, and we're going to be talking about that very soon as well. Now, what parents need to know about this, I think everyone knew that it can be smoked, but what a lot of people don't know is that it can be consumed in other ways as well. It can now be turned into candy, right? It can be made into candy form. It's available in cookies and in brownies. Coca-Cola released an article that they plan on actually making drinks that have CBD inside of it, right? It has CBD inside of it. And when you look at the business side of it, and this is just a quick tangent, the soda industry right now, in 2017 actually, was $76.4 billion. Soda industry, 2017, $76.4 billion worldwide. They're anticipating the legal marijuana industry by 2030 to be $75 billion, meaning it will be at par with the soda industry, and after 2030, it will actually overtake the soda industry. And you all know how much soda we consume, right? Almost every meal someone is having some sort of soda. So that is how much it is being consumed, and marijuana is going to catch up, they're saying, within approximately 10 years to that. So marijuana can also be taken as cookies, as candies, and in brownies. Now here's some scary statistics. The rate of cannabis is 2 times higher in youth 15 to 24 as it is in adults. Why is the age 15 to 24 such an important age? Who can tell me? What's happening 15 to 24? Your brain and your mind is still developing, right? So it's such an important age for young people, 15 to 24, yet the highest usage rates are in that age. And we'll be talking about later on the adverse effects of smoking marijuana at such a young age, Generally, males will use more marijuana than females, so there are much higher usage rates in males than there are in females, but females are catching up. They aren't being left behind. 1 in 5 teens, 15 to 19, have used marijuana in the past year. That's crazy. 1 in 5 teens, 15 to 19, have used it. By a show of hands, who amongst you is 15 to 19 over here? If you're between 15 to 19, right? So, it tells us a lot that, our community is growing. These are concepts that we need to be discussing and be frank and open about. What are the main reasons that people actually use marijuana? Okay, I want you to listen to the 5 main reasons, and then I want you to tell me which one is the most dangerous reason, okay? Listen to the 5 reasons, and I want you to tell me which one is the most dangerous reason. People will use it for pleasure. So this is just for the sake of feeling good. They want to have a good time, so they smoke marijuana. Number 2, they use it as a coping mechanism for stress, anxiety, and depression. Number 3, they use it for experimentation. That, hey, other people are trying it and they're talking about it, and I too want to try it and see what it is like. Number 4, they use it as a social experience. So when people get together, this is what they do when they are amongst their friends. And number 5, they use it based upon culture. When I heard about this, I found this very, very strange. But if you look in Indian history in particular, this dates back about 3,000 years, they actually have like a milkshake type drink that they mix cannabis and other fruit and milk substances with and drink it as a milkshake. So there are cultural and religious practices that actually consume marijuana. So now let's go back through these 5. Pleasure, coping mechanism, experimentation, social, and cultural. Which one is the most dangerous? Okay, let's do a vote here. How many of you feel pleasure is the most dangerous? Raise your hands. Pleasure? Okay, we have a few hands. How many of you think coping mechanism is the most dangerous? Raise your hands. How many of you think experimentation is the most dangerous? Raise your hands. How many of you think social is the most dangerous? Raise your hands. And how many of you think cultural is the most dangerous? Raise your hands. 2 people for cultural, alhamdulillah. Statistically speaking, and what they're anticipating statistics to show, the most dangerous mechanism is actually going to be the coping mechanism. Why? It's not a competition. It's not a competition. It's going to be the coping mechanism. Why? Because as human beings, particularly as Muslims, we have coping mechanisms to deal with stress and anxiety, right? Praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reciting Quran, making dua, speaking to professionals about our problems. These are the normal coping mechanisms that we're meant to use. But when people resort to any form of substance, whether it be alcohol, whether it be marijuana, or other narcotics and drugs, what they're doing is they're numbing the pain without actually dealing with the problem. numbing the pain without actually dealing with the problem. And that is something that is very, very dangerous. So that is the most, I guess, that is the thing that we have to be the most cautious of. What does smoking marijuana actually feel like? Alhamdulillah, I can confidently say, I don't know what that feels like. But research shows that it is the following. You will feel happy, you will feel relaxed, increased sociability, heightened sensations. Those are what they call the positive connotations with it. Here are the negatives now. Problems with memory and learning. Distorted perception in terms of your sight, your ability to hear, and your ability to touch. Trouble thinking and problem solving, and loss of motor coordination, right? Loss of motor coordination. So your ability to maneuver, that will be completely lost. Now what's important to mention over here? Two things to mention. Number one, not all marijuana is the same. So there are different types of marijuana, and marijuana is actually laced with other substances as well, like cocaine and other things as well. So the more potent the marijuana, the more adverse the effects. The second thing to keep in mind is that your tolerance level actually increases. So someone that does it for the first time is not someone that does it for like the 100th time. Their body will naturally get more accustomed to it, and they may be able to function almost normally to a certain degree, even though they're smoking marijuana. What about the laws? What's happening in terms of Canadian law, and what do we need to know about it? The big day is October 17th. So that is just around the corner for us, right? Approximately 10 days from now. The law is going to be as follows. If you're over 18, you are allowed possessing 30 grams of marijuana with you. You have more than 30 grams, it can become a criminal charge. What if you're under 18 years old? Under 18, if you have 5 grams or less, then this is at the discretion of the police officer themselves, but it will not be a criminal charge. You will not have a criminal record. If you have over 5 grams, then this will now become a criminal charge. This will now become a criminal charge. Public consumption of marijuana will still not be allowed. You'll not be allowed to smoke marijuana or use marijuana outside buildings or in parks, but you will be allowed to use it in private residences. What is something important to know about private residences? Landlords have the right to specify that you are not allowed smoking marijuana on their premise. Just like they say that you can't have pets and you can't smoke, they also have the right to say that you cannot use marijuana on their premise. So landlords will have that right. And the last section I want to cover is, what is the Islamic stance on marijuana? Is there a difference of opinion? Is there room for flexibility? How do we deal with these issues? Well, we have to understand that Islam has a reasoning behind each and every single one of its rulings. Rulings in Islam are not there just for the sake of having rulings, but rather there's reasoning behind them. The closest thing that we can relate to this to is alcohol. We will all agree that the consumption of alcohol in its purest form is haram. It is haram because it is an intoxicant. What are the ramifications spiritually if you use alcohol? The Prophet ﷺ tells us that our salah will not be accepted for 40 days. That is just the beginning of the consequences. Then you have medical reasons as well, the impact that it has on your liver, the impact that it has for you to think and comprehend and contemplate, and all of those things, right? So that is like alcohol. Now with marijuana, someone may come and say, hey, marijuana isn't mentioned in the Quran, so therefore it must be halal because everything in the dunya is halal. Now you may think that's a silly argument, but you would be surprised how many young people come up with that argument. It's not mentioned in the Quran, therefore it must be halal. But that's not the way our faith works. As I mentioned, everything has a reasoning in terms of its rulings. And if that reasoning is present in other substances, whether it's mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah or not, becomes irrelevant at that point, right? You can argue that, hey, cocaine isn't mentioned and all these other drugs aren't mentioned. But no one would actually argue that they're halal, right? Because we see the adverse effects that those things have. So recreational usage of marijuana is actually very, very simple. I'm confident in saying that it is haram to recreationally use marijuana. Now we get to the medicinal component of it, And this is where you will have a lot more discussion. What the scholars of Islam are in consensus of, they are in the ijma' of, anything that is haram as a general rule cannot be used for medicinal purposes, with the exception if there is no other alternative. With the exception of if there is no other alternative. This is ijma'. It is one of the fundamental pillars of Islamic jurisprudence, right? It is something very, very heavy and concrete. But now, what is happening as technology advances, you can manipulate and alter the chemical properties of these drugs. And that is why it's very important to understand what THC and CBD are. Dr. Nazir is going to be speaking more about some of those components. But from an Islamic perspective, if there is anything that will hinder the faculty of the mind and your ability to judge between right and wrong and your ability to protect your human life, then that is something that will become haram. But now as technology advances, they're able to remove the THC and leave the CBD component in it alone. And the CBD component in it, for the most part, does not affect your mental capabilities. So with that being said, a very short summary is that if the THC is removed and the CBD remains, that is something that will be permissible. But with the presence of the THC, then that is something that needs to be looked at. Will it hinder one's ability to process and to think or not? You can read a more detailed paper on this if you're interested at ilmsource.com. You go to ilmsource.com. There's a paper on medicinal marijuana by Abu Isa Ni'matullah. For those that are familiar with the Arabic language, then Sheikh Hatem Al-Hajj has a paper on the use of narcotics in medicine, and that is in the Arabic language. You can read more about that over there. I shall pass it over now to Dr. Nazir, and I will come back later on to talk about how youth can cope with better decision making and how parents can talk to their teens. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Naved. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'ana wa zidna ilma. So, inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to go into more detail. Sheikh Naved, mashallah, provided a good overview of some of the key points, from the scientific perspective, from the Islamic perspective. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the medical science behind marijuana. For myself, speaking as a medical doctor, this is information that many medical doctors will be familiar with or should be familiar with when they're talking to their patients about. And for myself, my specialty is in neuroimaging, so some of the specific harmful effects of marijuana on the brain, there's an interesting discussion about how it impacts, for example, the hippocampus. It decreases the white matter in the hippocampus. So these are some of the interesting tangents that I will mention as well, inshallah ta'ala. But to go back to the basic fundamentals of what Sheikh Navid was mentioning. So this plant that we're talking about, this drug, marijuana, first of all, it's not one drug, right? We mentioned that marijuana is the name for what people are using from cannabis, the plant cannabis, which has hundreds of different chemical compounds within it, hundreds of different chemicals within the plant cannabis. So first of all, why do they call it marijuana? Why is marijuana the more common name for it? Does anyone know? How did it come to be called marijuana? One of the arguments that's made is that the reason why it's more commonly referred to as marijuana is because previously, when these drugs were coming into the United States, the government wanted to refer to it more commonly as marijuana to play on people's racism towards foreigners, to stigmatize it. So they used the Mexican Spanish term for it, marijuana. So they said, oh, those crazy foreigners bringing in their drugs, the marijuana, right? To create a sense of more fear. And that's why when you go to the arguments, why are 70% or something like that Canadians in favor of allowing of legalizing marijuana, you'll see that a big part of it has to do with the racist way in which some of these laws were implemented. That the fact that African Americans were 4 times more likely to get arrested for possessing it than whites. So there was this kind of racist bias that a lot of people were concerned about as well. And also the idea that, if we're allowing alcohol, which has greater harms in society, why are we punishing people for marijuana? So we'll touch on that as well. But as we mentioned, marijuana is the name, is another name, but the plant itself is cannabis. And cannabis, there's different strains of it. So you have cannabis sativa, which is the common source that was being used for marijuana. But what happened was that people, initially when that was growing, there was only certain climates in which people could grow it. And then people discovered in the mountains in India, they discovered another strain called Cannabis indica. And they found that if they brought this back to the United States and they bred the two together, sativa and indica, they were able to create hybrids and they could breed it anywhere. And so that caused more cultivation of cannabis throughout the United States. Now, cannabis, as Sheikh Naveed mentioned, there's the two most important chemical compounds to know about. One is THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, and that's the component that is psychoactive, meaning that it alters the mind. It causes psychosis. Right? The other compound is CBD, cannabidiol, right? And that's the component that is said to be not psychoactive, but it also has some important effects on the body that we'll talk about as well. So what does it mean when we say that THC causes psychosis? What is psychosis? Yes. When you go crazy. That aren't there? You think things... What's that, sir? You think of things that aren't real. That's a very good explanation. So psychosis, it has, mashallah, it has different components to it. One is hallucinations, and another is delusions, right? So hallucination is when you perceive something that's not there. You see or hear or feel something and it's not actually there. So it's a disturbance of perception. A delusion is a disturbance of thought. So you think something's going on and it's not actually happening. You think that the television is talking to you. You think that somebody's coming out to chase you, right? You think that something's going on that's not actually happening. So you have hallucinations, you have delusions, you can also have alterations in your thoughts. They can become disorganized. The type of thoughts can get changed. Basically, your mind is no longer functioning the way that it should. So from an Islamic perspective, when we talk about the goals of Islam, the maqasid al-Sharia, what are the objectives that Islam is trying to achieve? This comes under the discussion of hifdul aql, right? The preservation of the mind. Because Islam wants for us to be able to use our rational faculties. It wants for us to cultivate our minds. So from the goals of Islam is to gain a good education, to learn and understand about the world. And also from the goals of Islam then is to prevent ourselves from using substances which negatively impact our mind. When we talk about the effects of marijuana, there are immediate effects and then there are long-term effects. So the immediate effects are, if somebody right now smokes marijuana, what's going to happen to their mind and what's going to happen to their body? The long-term effects is, when this person becomes a user of marijuana on a regular basis, what are the negative things that are going to happen? Okay? So in terms of immediate effects, how fast does it work? If somebody smokes it, it can start working within 5 minutes. Sometimes it can take up to half an hour, and it can last a total of 4 hours. That's how fast it starts to work. Within 5 minutes, it can start working. If somebody ingests it, they eat something containing that chemical compound, it has to go through their digestive system. It can take a little bit longer to start working. So it could take up to 3 hours even for it to start working. And that can be particularly dangerous because they may think it's not having an effect, and they may consume more and more and increase their dosage. And all of the effects are related to the dose, especially the harmful effects. The more harmful effects are seen, the more that a person consumes. So in terms of the effects on the mind, there's the reason why people consume it is because they get this euphoria, this happiness feeling. But in terms of the negative effect, there's also that psychosis, the hallucinations, the delusions. And chronically using this, they found that it has a lot of negative impacts on working memory, on planning and decision making, on disinhibition, meaning that you have poor impulse control. The ability to control oneself, control one's desires becomes weakened. And there's effects on the body as well. So, which we'll get to. The immediate effects on the body: a person's heart rate goes up, their blood pressure goes up, they may have slurred speech, their eyes become red. Right? That's something that a lot of people notice, that if somebody has been using marijuana, their eyes become red. They may have a dry mouth. They may become more hungry. Different things of that nature. Now, studies have shown, what are the effects of marijuana on the body. When you look at the brain in cannabis users, there was a systematic review that looked at multiple studies that were done, multiple research papers, 56 different papers, and they found that the hippocampus in the brain has a reduced gray matter density in people who are cannabis users, chronic cannabis users. What that means is the hippocampus is the structure in our brain that is associated with memory, right? So it shows you that you can actually see the changes on the brain when you do brain scans on these people who are chronically using this. In addition to that, some of these impacts are worse when the user is young. Okay, so Sheikh Navaid mentioned that that youth, up until a person's early 20s, their brain is still actually developing. So using cannabis during that time, it prevents the normal development. It can actually have greater negative harms because the brain is still in a more vulnerable state. And so people who are between the age 14 to 22, who used marijuana and then they stopped at age of 22. They didn't use it after that. Even still, at age 27, their cognitive capacity was less than their peers, their other students. Even at age 27, they couldn't keep up with some of their fellow classmates. And you think about that, that can be pretty sad for a kid who makes a bad life decision in their teenage years, and for the rest of their life, they may suffer the consequences of that decision because it takes them down a path where they're actually doing long-term damage to their brain. Now, other effects that it can have in some patients who use cannabis, one of the effects that you can get is, especially amongst people who are using it on a daily basis, it's a very unique syndrome that happens to cannabis users. It's called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. It's a very unique syndrome. What happens is these people actually start vomiting multiple times, again and again and again. In fact, they can vomit up to 5 times per day. And this just happens non-stop for them. And so what they end up doing, it's a very peculiar phenomenon. They end up taking multiple hot showers to try, because that's the only thing that relieves them. So if you hear about somebody taking, 10 hot showers a day, and they're throwing up 5-10 times a day, because of this can be cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. And in Colorado, where they've had this legalization of marijuana, they've seen increased emergency department visits for people with cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and increased medical costs associated with treating patients who have this condition. Also, in terms of the effects on the lungs, everybody knows about tobacco smoking, right, causing lung cancer. And a lot of research has been done on tobacco smoking and lung cancer. Cannabis is still newer, but the research is that's already being done is starting to show the same kinds of things. Because the bottom line is, whenever you inhale something into your lung, that small particles, it causes inflammation in the lungs, and that inflammation ends up causing the cells to develop mutations and cause cancer. So chronic inflammation in the lungs is always going to have negative impacts. And so what they found is that when people smoke marijuana, this actually has the same chemicals that people find in some of the same chemicals, like benzpyrene, benzanthracene. These are carcinogens. They actually cause cancer. The major exception that marijuana doesn't have is nicotine, which is in tobacco smoking. But it has a lot of the other chemicals. And when they take a biopsy of a patient's lungs, they take a tissue sample, they see the same changes happening in the lungs that they see in patients who have tobacco smoking. And there was a study that was done in the Journal of Global Oncology which found increased rates of lung cancer amongst patients who were smoking marijuana. So when Sheikh Navaid was speaking earlier about the reasons why marijuana could be haram, one of them is intoxication, but another one of them is the harm that it does to a person's body. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة. Do not throw yourself into destruction. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ, and do not kill yourself. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us not to do harm to ourselves. So our body is an amana. We don't want to be taking a substance that is going to cause lung cancer, that is going to cause permanent damage in the brain. These are some of the harmful negative effects. And you know, subhanAllah, one of the interesting things that I want to mention is that there's a lot of media out there from people who are almost cult-like supporters of marijuana. I was speaking to one Muslim brother who's actually a neuroscientist who does full-time research in cannabis and its relationship to mental disorders like schizophrenia. And he said that an interesting point that he mentioned is that for some people it's almost like a religion. Like they want to just say that marijuana cures cancer, marijuana does this, marijuana does that. And subhanAllah, I saw some of these popular YouTube talk shows where the people are speaking about marijuana, and one guy was saying, oh, of course it's good for the body, right? You know, when you smoke marijuana, it's not bad for your lungs, it's good for your lungs. It clears out all the mucus in your lungs. And subhanAllah, this shows you the harms of ignorance in our times, because the reason why people who smoke marijuana, they cough out more mucus is because it actually destroys the normal mucus clearing system in your lungs, the cilia, the normal epithelium in the lungs, and it replaces that with mucus secreting goblet cells, which are actually secreting more mucus. So when you're coughing up more mucus, it's not because you're clearing out your lungs, it's because you've actually destroyed the normal lining in the lungs, and now your lungs are producing more mucus. So that's one of the harms as well. Also, in terms of some of the other points to consider, so we mentioned that mental illness is something that it has been associated. Now the link is not cause and effect between schizophrenia and cannabis, which is important to clarify. It's not that somebody smokes marijuana, they get schizophrenia, but it's showing that there's an interesting connection where a person might have an increased predisposition to getting schizophrenia, and marijuana makes it worse, right? So there is some kind of connection that is there, and there's more research that's being done on this as well. Now, lastly, I want to get to what are some of the quote-unquote medical benefits that people are talking about, and can somebody take marijuana for medical purposes. The College of Family Physicians of Canada released a set of guidelines in February of this year, and these are guidelines for family doctors across Canada to reference and use in treating their patients. And you'll notice that in these guidelines, there's a lot that's mentioned about it. First of all, it mentions right at the beginning, in general, we recommend against prescribing medical marijuana, except for very few indications where where evidence has been brought, and other medications don't work. So, subhanAllah, when Shaykh Naveen mentions about what the scholars of fiqh are saying about using it as a last resort, it's actually the same thing that the medical doctors are saying, right? So if you look at what is the advice about using it for chronic pain, they actually mention that you can use it if you've tried 3 or more other medications that are not working for your neuropathic pain. So they mention it as a third line option. Right? Similarly, for palliative end-of-life care in cancer patients, they have to have tried 2 other medications that don't work, then you can consider it. And if somebody is considering medical cannabis, they shouldn't be using just a street product, they should be using a pharmaceutical product that has been manufactured by pharmacies and tested in patients to know that it's safe as well. Other proven areas where there has been some benefit, there's research relating to CBD, and there's also research relating to THC. So remember, THC is the one that's psychoactive, and that would be the one that's more controversial from an Islamic perspective. THC is the one that seems to actually suppress vomiting. The CBD is the one that doesn't have that vomiting suppression effect. Now THC, there's some research talking about using it in chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting. So patients taking chemotherapy for cancer who get nausea and vomiting, there's some research showing that it may have a role in that situation. In terms of seizures, that's another situation where CBD has been shown to have some benefit in kids who have specific seizure syndrome. So for example, there's a syndrome called Dravet syndrome. Babies who have these repeated seizures and nothing else seems to be working, a doctor may prescribe medical cannabis. Similarly, there's another seizure-related syndrome in kids, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is another one where CBD may have a benefit. CBD may have a benefit. Now, as Muslims, we encourage scientific research. I think it's important to emphasize that. And yes, we're emphasizing some of the negative harms, so people don't take this matter lightly, and they don't say, oh, you know, there's not a serious consequence to it. But there is also some ongoing medical research that shows, that may expand the role for medical marijuana in some cases. So there's interesting research about cancers where medical marijuana may actually suppress the growth of tumors, and that research shows that it can have different effects depending on the specific concentration. So it's not for a person to just take a street product and say, oh, you know, if I have a medical condition, or if I have asthma, marijuana will cure my asthma, you know, as some people claim, right? This is something that has to go through a physician. They have to look at the whole medical situation. They have to look at other drugs that are being used and then come to a conclusion. And the risk of dependency, it seems to be about 10% a risk for a person to become dependent on cannabis. And one of the things Sheikh Navid mentioned is the most dangerous is when people use it as a coping mechanism. That also has a greater risk for them to become dependent on it, because they get stressed, they take marijuana. They get stressed again, they take marijuana. It becomes a cycle for them. I want to conclude with just a general Islamic perspective on this. First of all, one of the arguments that is often made in support of marijuana is that we allow alcohol, and alcohol is more harmful, and so therefore, what's the problem with marijuana? That's an argument somebody may make to support legalizing marijuana in society. And from an Islamic perspective, there's no doubt that alcohol is bad. That's something Muslims would agree. Alcohol is the worst. And subhanAllah, I remember seeing how the medical evidence has evolved over the years. When I was in medical school, they used to say that alcohol in moderate quantities can be good for you, but in larger quantities it's harmful. And they used to tell people, don't drink if it's more than a few drinks, then it's bad. But subhanAllah, this year, as the evidence evolves, the conclusions change. And this year, there was a big study that was published that said, no amount of alcohol is safe for you. No amount of alcohol is safe. And subhanAllah, when you study alcohol, you see that every organ in the body that it touches, it damages, right? So whether you're talking about alcohol's effect on the mouth and the throat causing oral cancer, or its effect on the stomach causing gastritis, or its effect on the liver causing liver cirrhosis, or its effect on the brain causing Wernicke's encephalopathy, almost everything that it's touching, it's in the body, it's causing disease. SubhanAllah. And in addition to all the crimes that increase because of alcohol, all the rapes that happen under the influence of alcohol, all the drunk driving incidents, all of the negative impacts in society. And they say, well, from an Islamic perspective, we say clearly it's harmful, therefore this is something that should be prohibited. And somebody may say, well, we tried prohibition in the West, it didn't work. And this is something that I think it's useful for us to reflect on. From an Islamic perspective, why is it that when the command was revealed in Medina to prohibit alcohol, immediately people threw away what they were drinking? The streets of Medina were flowing with this alcohol that they were emptying out, and people act upon it instantly. Whereas in the West, when they tried to do that, it didn't work. The answer to this is in a beautiful hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she says, if the first thing that was revealed in Islam was the command, La tashrabul khamar. If the first thing revealed in Islam was the command, don't drink alcohol, people would have said, we're never going to leave alcohol. But the first things that were revealed in Islam were the mention of Jannah and Nar, the mention of the afterlife, the spiritual reminders for the human being, building that spiritual connection between the human being and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She says, حَتَّى إِذَا ثَابَتَ الْقُلُوبُ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَزَلَ الْحَلَالُ وَالْحَرَامُ. Until when hearts became firmly attached in their connection with their Lord, then the commands for prohibition and permissibility were revealed. So what it shows us in Islam is that you can't force a society to leave something that they want to follow their desires in doing if it's just based on laws and legal punishments. It has to have a spiritual implication for them. It has to be because a person spiritually believes this thing is harmful. This is going to harm my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This may close doors for me that I won't be able to open again. They have to have that spiritual foundation. And for parents, it shows us that we need to emphasize in engaging with the youth, use wisdom and focus on building a relationship with your children. Don't focus on if your only relationship with your kid is do this and don't do this. What kind of relationship is that? Do you think they will feel comfortable coming to you? And would you want your kid to leave something just because they say, I don't want my parents to find out I'm doing that? What's better, that they say, I'm not going to do this because my parents said so, or they say, I'm not going to do this because I believe that it will take me away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Which is the better option? So you see, when the youth came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he said, Ya Rasulullah, give me permission to do zina. Give me permission to fornicate. What did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ say? Did he say, oh, he needs a beating, somebody grab chappals, grab the sandals? No. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ didn't physically discipline him or even scold him. He didn't even say something negative to him. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reasoned with him. He said, would you like that for your mother or for your daughter or for your sister? And he explained it to him in a way that the youth understood, and increased his taqwa and his spiritual connection. So, to conclude, we should focus on building the spiritual foundations when we're engaging with the youth. And the conclusion from a medical standpoint is that there are many proven harms to marijuana. The research is very clear, especially for young adults. For teenagers, the harms can be even worse. There are some medical benefits that are being studied, and Islam promotes scientific research. Islam wants us to have an academic perspective, to learn more and to find cures to diseases, because the Prophet ﷺ said, for every disease there is a cure. Right? And with the right cure, it will be, if you find the right treatment, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission, it will be cured. But the focus, the consensus from both medical doctors and from Islamic scholars is that those medical treatments, that's a case of using it as a last resort when other things are not working. Inshallah ta'ala, with that I'll conclude. I know I went over time. Jazakallah khairan. I'll pass it to Sheikh Ali.
Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Nazir, for sharing with us your findings and that very beneficial information. What I would like to do now is shed some light on really the importance of understanding why this law that will be soon passed is going to affect our community, right? Our community. As we know, the title for today's lecture is What Our Community Needs to Know About Cannabis. One thing we need to realize and really understand is that society is changing. And we find that society continuously and constantly throws in our path temptation and desire. And we're getting to the point now where it becomes difficult as a parent, or it becomes difficult as a youth, to hold on to some of your own beliefs and some of your values and your morals. It's become difficult. And this is actually something that the Prophet ﷺ prophesied over 1400 years ago, where he said, يَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٌ الْقَابِضُ عَلَى دِينِهِ كَالْقَابِضِ عَلَى الْجَمَرِ. That there will come a time, and I think we have a strong argument to say that we are in this time now, today, where the person who wants to hold on to his deen, or hold on to his values, or his morals, or what he believes in, it becomes difficult. So much so that it is as if they are juggling a burning coal in their hand. So it's only natural as Muslims to feel as if at times we are going against society and the norms of society and what, society deems as acceptable and correct and right and cool. It's an uphill battle. You're going against the grain and you're fighting a current. And you're turning into somewhat of a stranger. But this is a good thing. As the Prophet ﷺ taught us, كُن فِي الدُّنْيَا كَأَنَّكَ غَرِيبٌ أَوْ عَابِرِ السَّبِيلِ. So it's okay to feel at times that, you know what, I don't fit in. Everybody around me is doing something and I'm not doing it, and I'm the outcast or I'm the black sheep. That's okay. كُن فِي الدُّنْيَا كَأَنَّكَ غَرِيبٌ. Be in this life as if you are a stranger. Now, the reality is that when it comes to the legalization of marijuana, everyone is going to be affected. Everyone will be affected. Some more than others, but we will all be affected in some way. I was in a print shop just a couple weeks ago. I was getting some books prepared, and the owners of this print shop, they're Muslims, good friends of the community. And I was speaking to them, and all of a sudden the issue of marijuana came into play. And the mother, she was very concerned, and she said to me, she said, Ali, I'm concerned. And I said, what is your concern? She said that right now as we speak, they are opening up a marijuana cannabis dispensary. Meaning this is going to be the hot spot. You know Toys R Us? This is Weed R Us. You find anything you want in there. From the candies, as Sheikh was mentioning, the different edibles, the different strains of marijuana. It's all there. And it looks nice, and they put it in beautiful packaging so that when you see it, you're curious. And she's very worried. She said, I'm worried, number one, about my community, meaning my neighborhood. And I'm even more so worried about my children and the influence that this place may have on them. Now, as I mentioned, we're all going to be affected. But the demographic from within our community that will be affected most are the youth. Hands down. And that is something the youth must understand. And that is something those who are responsible for the youth, whether it be the parents, whether it be the imams, whether it be any type of youth coordinators, whether it even be a big brother or a big sister, we need to understand that there is going to be a war on drugs. And the reality is some of us will be harmed, some of us will fall victim, and some of us will triumph. That is the reality. I have been dealing with the youth in this community for some time. And when it comes to drug use, I've dealt with many different types of youth. There are youth who are interested in trying, in smoking weed because everybody around them are doing it. There are youth who are in it so deep that they feel as if they're addicted and there's no way out. And there are youth who are actually dealing these drugs. Literally, they're dealing these drugs, they're making a profit, they're making money off other Muslim kids in order for them to benefit just a little bit from this dunya. One thing I've realized in dealing with the youth, especially those who are in it, and I know a lot of youth who are in it, and these are Muslim youth, right? Don't think for a second that your child is completely safe, or there's a force field around your child when he or she steps out of the house and this will not affect them. Do not fool yourself. But one of the things that I've begin to recognize is the why. And the why is so important. Why are our children interested in smoking marijuana? Why are our children indulging in this type of activity? Why? And why is it important for us as parents and as guardians and as leaders to understand the why? Because if we understand the why, ultimately, we can attack it. And we can address it. And we can offer our youth alternatives, because this is what they need. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for everything that He has made haram, there is an alternative that is halal. And it is our duty to aid and help and assist our youth in finding these alternatives. Now, what I would like to do is share with you some of my experience. Sheikh Navaid mentioned a few of these things. I believe it was 5. What I've done is I've been able to categorize these reasons of why into 2 different segments. There are external factors and there are internal factors. As for the external factor, one of the main reasons why we find our children so curious and so intrigued and so, willing to want to indulge in marijuana and different types of drugs is because of friendship. It's because of companionship. It's because of the people they hang around. And I'll tell you this right now, the people that your children hang around are the most influential people in your children's life. The people, the friends that your children hang around are more influential to them than you, than me, than Allah, and than Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is the reality. Their influence is there. And if our youth do not recognize this, then they will only fall victim. It only takes one youth, one kid, to come and pollute and introduce this type of idea. One kid. So what's the solution? Ya shabab, look at your friends. This is the advice of the Prophet. Your friends, you are on the deen, you are on the way of life as your friends. So look at the type of people you surround yourselves with. If there are people who are bringing you khair, then khair. If there are people that are bringing you shar, then step back away. Because the people that you hang around and the things that you do with them today will ultimately mold you into the person that you become tomorrow. That is the reality. And we have this idea that we need all these friends. We need more friends. Junior high, high school, university. Our youth have this idea that we need, the more friends we have, the more happier we will be, or the more accepted we will feel. But in reality, the more friends that you have, the more peer pressure you are going to face. And I'll tell you something about marijuana, weed, dope, that the number one reason why people try for the first time marijuana is because of peer pressure. Now afterwards there might be other reasons why they continue, but the initial reason why the majority of young men and young women indulge in marijuana use is because of the peer pressure. So you have to have this idea of quality over quantity when it comes to the people that you surround yourself with. Ya shabab, do you hear me? Shabab, do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Wallahi, we never had this growing up. We never had a community who would come and take the time. When Sheikh Navaid reached out to me, he said, Ali, let's do this. I said, this is maybe the first time it's ever happened in this city.
In the country possibly.
Maybe even in the country. We've never had this. Don't take this for granted. Don't take it for granted. Don't think we're just up here trying to, enjoy a Friday night, but rather we're up here trying to give you some sincere advice, whether it be Islamically, whether it be medically, whether it be socially. This is why we are here. The second external factor is recreation. A lot of young guys, especially when they get in university and they become 16 years old, they get a car, they get a driver's license. They want to just go out and do something. But the reality is there's never anything to do. And even as a Muslim, you say, well, I can't go to the parties, and I can't go here, and I can't go there. Go to Tim Hortons right now. Go to any Tim Hortons right now. Go to the parking lot. You will find a 5-seater with 8 teenagers in it. And they're rolling up weed. They're smoking a joint. They're smoking out of the pipe. They're smoking out of the bong. They're getting high. They're listening to music and they say, hey, we're doing something. It gives them something to do. At times, wallahi, I cannot blame them. Because what is the alternative? What have we as a community offered as an alternative? So what are they left with? This is how they enjoy themselves on a Friday, Saturday night. Your environment matters. In terms of internal factors, and this is the most concerning factor for me, and we've mentioned it, and we've all agreed that the internal factor of using marijuana to numb your pain. Ya shabab, listen to me. To numb your pain. Wallah, I asked him, I said, why are you smoking? He says, Wallahi Ali, it just makes me forget about everything. It numbs the pain. I forget about my problems. And this is so concerning because I tell the young man, I tell the young woman, that you're 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. What problems? I'm not negating, the issues that our youth are facing. But ya shabab, as you grow and you become older, you're going to face a lot more struggle in your life. None of you guys have a spouse that you need to take care of. None of you guys have children that you need to take care of. None of you guys are paying rent. None of you guys are working a 9 to 5. None of you guys are responsible for, a business. And as you become older, you're going to be facing these problems. And if you are relying on these types of substances to numb the pain, then what is happening is you're only causing more harm. And when weed finally is no longer the answer, you move to the harder drug. As they say, marijuana is the gateway drug. It's true. Because especially if you're using it for your problems, everybody is going to face issues and hardship in their life. And if we're using this as a means to, subdue this emotion and pain, then we're only causing more pain. I always tell the shabab, it's like a jarh. It's like a slash, when you get cut. You need to go to the hospital and you need to go and get stitches. You need to sanitize it. Or you can just go grab a Band-Aid and put it on top. What's going to happen? You want a quick fix, but what's ultimately going to happen to that scar on your arm, or that scar in your heart? It's going to become infected. It's going to become infected until they have to amputate it. And it's no longer a part of you. You've lost a part of yourself. That's what drugs do to you. That's why when somebody's cracked out or somebody's high, say, you're not acting like yourself. Because they lost a part of themselves. Just imagine this, picture this. When you blow that weed out, ya shabab, that's a part of you coming out. Right? And this is what they do sometimes. They say, who can take the biggest hit? Meaning, who who can lose themselves the most. This is the reality. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our youth. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the means and the know-how in offering alternatives for our youth so they don't have to resort to these types of substances. Jazakumullah khair. I will pass it back to Sheikh Navait so he can conclude.
Okay, so my concluding remarks were meant to deal with how parents should talk to their teens, and then, how do youth make better decisions in their lives. I'm going to skip the part about how parents should speak about their teens, and I'm going to explain why. Every tip that I have about how parents should speak about their teens is coming from this booklet over here. This booklet is produced by the government and is being distributed for free. You can download a soft copy from the internet, and we actually have 15 copies over here. So we're going to give half to the sisters and half to the brothers. What I'm going to ask is only parents should take this booklet. Only parents should take this booklet. If the booklets run out, send me an email and I'll send you a soft copy of the booklet, or at least tell you how you can order a physical copy. This is where you will find techniques on how to speak to your youth, to your teenagers, about marijuana. We have a second resource over here, which is produced by YouthLink, the partners of CPS. And these resources are just about more information. Pretty much everything that we've said, there's like a similar link that you can find on this, with the exception of the Islamic component. The social component, the medical component, the harms of it, the relationship with mental health, and all of those issues, you will find a link for it. We have 50 copies of these. Again, we'll split half and half between the brothers and the sisters. What's not mentioned in these resources is how do we develop resilience? How do we develop more critical thinking skills in making better decisions for ourselves? And this is where I just want to give 3 quick points to our youth. That in life in general, just apply these 3 questions, right? Question number 1, do I have the information that I need to make this choice? Do I have the information that I need to make this choice? Why is that important? Because you need to understand what the consequences of your choices actually are. We spoke about the spiritual consequence. Can you imagine your salah not being valid for 40 days? For 40 days straight, you're praying, but it's not having an effect. It's not being accepted. Why? Because you're using drugs, you're using alcohol, right? That's just a spiritual reason not to do it. So make sure you have all of the information that you need before you make a choice. Number 2, how does this fit with my values? Each and every one of us has a value system. We understand what is good, we understand what is bad. And the mistake that people make is that they're willing to compromise on their values for other reasons. For the sake of fitting in, for the sake of numbing the pain, for the sake of trying something new. All of these reasons will be presented. You have to understand that your values are what make you as a person. That is the only thing that you have as an individual, is your values. And never compromise on those values. So hold strong to those values that you have and never compromise on them. So number 1, information. Number 2, your values. And number 3, that even if you think you have enough information, even if you think, you know what, I can let my value go for a while, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has internally placed inside of you a system, a moral compass, that when you're about to do something wrong, your heart rate will go up. You will get nervous. You will start to feel sick to your stomach till you make that decision. That is your body telling you, you shouldn't be doing this. So if you're going through with it, just pay attention to how your body feels. If your body is telling you not to do it, it's telling you not to do it for a reason. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be doing this. Get out of that situation. Get out of that situation. And what really, really helps is having a family member or a friend on standby. So what that means is, you have your phone, and just as like a subtle clue word, maybe something like, something very obvious would be help. They come and pick you up right away. But you can make it even more subtle if you're afraid that your friends are checking what you're typing on your phone. Make it even something more subtle. Just type the word like clown or something. Where your family or your friend, they know that you want to get out of the situation that you're in. They come and pick you up and take you somewhere else. You have that word to get out of that situation. At the end of the day, no matter what we tell you, you have to make these decisions for yourself. No matter what your parents enforce upon you, you will one day turn 18 and have the freedom to do in this country whatever you like. But the only thing that will keep you in check is a reminder that one day you will stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Have you prepared the answer? Right, that's the only thing I want to leave with as advice, inshallah. So again, we have these resources available. We will be giving them out. I just want to give one last push for our event next week, which is the role of Muslim women in the community. That's going to be happening on Friday night at 7 p.m. at our new location in downtown, 1009 7th Avenue. It is such an integral conversation to have. So we want all of our brothers and sisters to come out. It's going to be myself and 3 female panelists, Sister Hajar, Sister Rola, and Sister Suad. So please do come out and check that event out. That's 7 p.m. next week in downtown. We want to leave the rest of the time for question and answers. If you want to write down something private, you can write it down on a piece of paper and send it up. If you have a question that you want to ask by hand, you can ask by hand. We also have a mic available for our sisters, inshallah. And you can pose your question to all 3 of us or leave it open, and then all 3 of us will give it a go, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. So the first question is, why did Canada legalize cannabis or marijuana in Canada?
All right, Bismillah. So, why did Canada do it? Why did Canada make marijuana legal? First of all, the number one reason why any law change happens in any country is if the majority of people are in support of it. So the bottom line was the majority of Canadians wanted it to happen. So it's about 70% of people wanted it to happen. But if you look at what are the reasons why Canadians wanted this to happen. So there's a few arguments, and many of them are, even from an Islamic perspective, you can see a lot of merit to some of the arguments. So some of the arguments that are made, that the money that is used from marijuana being sold is going into the hands of gangs and organized crimes. So one of the arguments was made was that if we do this, that money instead goes to the government, and it decreases a source of revenue for some of these gangs. It decreases a major source of revenue. Another argument that was made was that a lot of people who are using marijuana, it will become safer for them if it's legalized, because the marijuana that they're getting on the streets, it could be contaminated, it could have other drugs mixed into it, it could be more deadly, the dosage could be altered, and so they could have a lot worse medical problems if it's not legalized. And they felt that if it was legalized, then you can regulate it more. You can make it easier to make sure that kids aren't getting it. That was one of the arguments. I'm not commenting on this argument being valid or invalid. I'm saying, well, this is what the argument was that caused people to want to legalize it. Now, then those are arguments that in general, if we can keep the level of the noise down, I know some people are getting up to leave, but if we can keep the level of the noise down for the benefit of and inshallah ta'ala, we're going to be praying salah as well, and there's people who are already praying. So for everyone, just if you could keep the level of the noise down. So the other arguments that are used, bottom line is, some of them stem from different philosophies, moral philosophies, right? So a big moral philosophy for a lot of people in the West is the philosophy of liberalism, right? The idea that if I want to do something and it brings me pleasure and it's not hurting somebody else, nobody should prevent me from doing it. If I want to do something that brings me pleasure, nobody has the right to tell me not to do it. That fundamental philosophy drives a lot of the changes in policy. Now, from an Islamic perspective, we have a very different view. We actually believe that if you want to do something that brings you pleasure, but it's not good for you spiritually, you can actually, the way to become a better person is by actually controlling your desires, restraining your desires. There's no concept of restraining your desires in that other philosophy, right? So a big part of it is, in Islam, we believe you should control your nafs. You should do mujahadatun nafs. You should strive against your desires. You should not do following your shahawat, your desires or your hawa. Whereas for a lot of people whose only value in society, or whose only purpose in life is, we're here in this worldly life, the only thing that we can do here is to maximize pleasure. of course they will want to do that, right? Now, as a statistic, 40% of Canadians have used marijuana at some point themselves. So already so many people were using it. And so for many people they felt, look, if we allow alcohol, why aren't we allowing marijuana? So these are some of the arguments why people wanted to legalize it. Obviously, from an Islamic perspective, we have a critique of some of those arguments. Some of the arguments, they may have merit if it can be proven that it prevents a mafsada, it prevents a harm, right? If you can actually decrease organized crime by doing this and regulate it more so people are being less harmed, that would be an Islamically acceptable argument. But there's other arguments as well that, from an Islamic standpoint, we wouldn't agree that just because something brings you pleasure and you want to do it, that therefore there's not a problem.
We have a question from the sisters, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
The sister's question was hemp hearts or hemp seeds. Are they able to be consumed in protein shakes as food? They have 0.3% THC.
So in general, the rulings in Islam are related to the substance having an effect on the human being, right? So some people say, well, even in orange juice, there's like a 0.00% of alcohol. Therefore, should we not drink orange juice, right? The Islamic rulings come into effect when that percentage is enough that if a person drinks it, it will actually cause intoxication. Now the Prophet Muhammad said that whatever intoxicates in large amounts, ما سكر كثيره فقليله حرام, right? Whatever intoxicates in large amounts, then even a small amount is impermissible. Meaning that if there was something that if you eat a lot of it or you drink a lot of it, you'll get drunk, then even a small amount wouldn't be permissible. Now, when it comes to orange juice, no matter how much orange juice you drink, you'll never get drunk, right? No matter how much of the hemp seeds you have, you won't have the hallucinations, right? So that's the principal ruling there. Exactly.
Let's go back to the sisters. Yeah.
So the next question is, as an international medical graduate, I have been offered a position of a clinical assistant in a cannabis clinic. Is this permissible?
So there's a few things to consider. First of all, we talked about what the ruling would be for somebody to take, the medication, and we said that to prescribe medical cannabis, you have to follow certain guidelines, and the guidelines from the doctors are the same as the guidelines from the Islamic scholars, really. That you have to use it as a last resort for something that has been proven to have an indication, right? So if somebody was staying within those guidelines and was, avoiding prescribing, I would say take an extra cautious approach, right? So, for example, THC is the part of marijuana that causes the psychosis, right? It causes the intoxicating effects. If a person says, okay, I would try to avoid prescribing that unless it was absolutely necessary. A patient has debilitating pain, they've tried 3 other medications, it's still refractory to that, and then I would prescribe that in that situation. That's Islamically, that's considered darura. It's a medical necessity. Or if somebody says, I'm going to focus on prescribing CBD in those proven indications, and it's not intoxicating. If somebody restricts themselves to those things that are proven, they're generally erring on the side of caution. The Prophet Muhammad said, "Inna al-halal bayyin wa inna al-haram bayyin." The halal is clear and the haram is clear. Wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat la ya'lamuhunna kathirun min an-nas. And between those two, there's a gray area. A lot of people may not know about it, right? A lot of people may not know the answer. But as scholars or somebody who has expertise, they may know that, okay, this thing that seems like it's in the gray area, maybe it's actually halal. This thing that seems like it's in the gray area, maybe it's actually haram. But obviously the approach from the Prophet Muhammad advises in general, فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ, right? Somebody who avoids, is extra cautious about the gray area, they've protected their deen and their honor. وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبَهَاتِ وَقَعَ فِي الْحَرَامِ. And whoever just always is in the gray area, they're always doing things in the gray area. They say, okay, this is kind of unclear, medical marijuana here or not. Okay, just prescribe it. Just prescribe it. If you're not being extra cautious and extra vigilant, you're going to end up doing things that cross over into haram, right? So you want to be extra cautious about those things. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
Repeat the question, inshallah.
Yeah. So the question was joking in about marijuana and saying, hey, I'm going to go out and go smoke a joint. I'll just give it to you as the Prophet ﷺ gave it to the Ummah. من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت. That if you believe in Allah and you believe in His Messenger in the Day of Judgment, then it is only that you speak good and proper, or you just don't say anything at all. It's a very simple principle, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
My issue is, who do we trust?
Excellent.
Jazakallah khair. I definitely empathize with the question. The question is, when there's all this conflicting information out there, who do we trust? And subhanAllah, this is especially a difficulty in the times that we're living in. The Prophet ﷺ warned us that during the end of times, there would be many speakers, but few scholars, right? Many people spreading information, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us in the end of times, a lie would be considered a truth and a truth would be considered a lie. We're living in the age of alternative facts, right? We're living in an age where everybody makes up their own facts, right? SubhanAllah. And part of it also has to do with a culture of rejecting authority, right? Nowadays, the patient comes to the doctor and the doctor says, this is your diagnosis and this is the medication that you need. And the patient said, but I Googled it. And I don't need that medication, right? I Googled it, I watched a YouTube video, and I saw an Instagram post, and I think you're trying to kill me, right? So now the doctor doesn't know what to do, right? So there's this problem in society where you have many people who are speaking, and many people may not be qualified. The important thing, Muslims identified this problem early on. When people were narrating hadith, they would say, tell us, who did you hear from? Who named to us your isnad? Where is your ijazah? Who is the one who taught you? So in the same way now, in the West, we have a concept of credentials, right? When somebody gives you a claim, is it backed up by medical evidence? Is it coming from published medical data that has been approved and become consensus guidelines published by doctors that are practiced across the country, right? So, for example, the case of vaccines causing autism, this is, a controversy that's been stirred up by many vocal celebrities, and a lot of people are influenced by this. But if you ask, every medical council, you ask the Canadian College of Family Doctors, you ask the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, you ask people who are licensed from these regulatory bodies, they will say no, there's no evidence to that, because we have to follow the scientific evidence. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah said, every claim has to be backed up by either a direct evidence from logic or from senses, from your perception. And in medicine, we have a system to gather evidence. So if somebody claims that a medication works, we don't just give it to patients. First, you have to do something called a randomized clinical trial. So you take a large group of thousands of people and you give them that medication. And you take another group of thousands of people and you give them something that looks exactly like that medication, but it's just an empty tablet. It's just sugar. And it's called a placebo. And then you see, does it actually have a proven benefit, right? And both groups think they're taking the medication, right? And so with marijuana, they've done some of these trials, right? They've given some people THC, they've given some people placebo, and a lot of the claimed benefits are not actually proven benefits when you do a scientific study. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
Now, your question is very important, and that is, how do you help someone that is addicted to marijuana and cannabis? So inshallah, we'll get a social perspective on that, and we'll also get a medicinal perspective on that. I spoke the whole time. No,
I don't have
Okay, so someone that's addicted, I think clearly understand, you have to take them to someone that's qualified. But the most important thing is getting them to understand that they need help. So here's multiple things that you need to understand. Number one, if it's someone that you know and is a friend, continue being a friend for them. Make them feel loved. Make them feel as if they're not alone. Make them feel that you have their best interests in mind. Number two, if it's someone young, speak to their parent. If it's someone older, then that's something that they have to get out on their own. And usually what they end up doing nowadays is called an intervention. And that is they get everyone that cares about this person all together in the room. That person comes to that place and they pretty much share that, hey, I'm concerned about you and this is why you need to seek help. The most difficult part of this process is the emotional support that these people need. Because relapse is something that is very, reoccurring. So they will need that support. Now what I would encourage this person with, that in their darkest moments of darkness, is to seek help with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their faith as they're getting the psychological help that they need as well. That's just a quick summary of what I wanted to share. That is a great question that you asked, inshallah.
So high school, like you said, so around the age of 15 to 16 is where you all said that cannabis is, what usually when people start using it. So do counselors in high schools train professionally to deal with these types of situations?
Yes, so the question is, are counselors at schools trained to deal with this? In Canada, the law is still anyone under 18 is not allowed to consume it. So the counselors are trained into dealing with that situation. So yeah, feel free to speak to your school counselor as well, inshallah. So we're going to conclude with that, guys. Jazakumullah khairan to everyone that attended. If you have further questions, all three of us will be sticking around after Salah, and we will also go to the sisters' side as well. So if there are any questions, we can answer them after Salah, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.